following panel is brought to you by DoorDash. DoorDash is committed to supporting the communities we serve and establish contactless delivery as default to help protect customers, merchants, and dashers. Learn more at blog.doordash.com.
Welcome to the CityTalk podcast, premiering at this year's 2020 Texas Tribune Festival. This is a program that is developed in partnership with the LBJ Urban Lab at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin and the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University. I'm Stephen Pedigo, Faculty Director of the LBJ Urban Lab, and I'm pleased to host today's conversation about the rise of contactless cities in the age of COVID-19. The pandemic has dramatically affected how we live, work, and play in our communities. We're ordering more takeout, we're making more meals at home, we're working remotely as our offices and workspaces sit empty, and we're gathering digitally with friends for coffee and happy hours rather than in person. As we look to the future, which of these trends will stick? How will our communities be different? And how will the nature of our workplaces transform? We're joined by three outstanding guests, each bringing a different perspective to this conversation. Our first guest, Tony Montero, is the CEO of High Hospitality, the award-winning restaurant group of Uchi and others here in Austin, and he's been in this role since 2016. Previously, he was the Regional Vice President of Operations for the Cheesecake Factory and the Senior Vice President of Craftwork Restaurants and Breweries. Our second guest is Bonnie Reese. Bonnie is the Regional Consulting Practice Leader for Gensler, a global design and architecture firm. Previously, she led qualitative research and social impact projects for Frog Design for 9 years. Our final guest is my friend and colleague, Sam Chandan. Sam is the Larry and Clara Silverstein Chair in Real Estate Development and Investment and the Dean of the NYU School Schack Institute of Real Estate. He's the founder of Shannon Economics, an advisory firm servicing the institutional real estate industry. Sam, Bonnie, Tony, welcome to today's podcast, and thank you for joining us. So Tony, let's start with you. Obviously, the restaurant industry has been greatly impacted by COVID-19. How have restaurant organizations like yours been able to adapt so quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of it for us, and I think most restaurants, you started kind of seeing the writing on the wall, what was going to happen in February. So you started making a plan. The biggest thing that everybody had to do is adapt to go and curbside and, expanded patio areas, dining out hours, as well as, package deals, so everybody was doing something different, but you had to be quick on your feet and innovative to really get through this last 6 months. And, I think we're still, as a restaurant industry, we're still adapting to it. I think the biggest thing you've seen is really the switch over to curbside and to go. A lot of restaurants, including a lot of our restaurants prior to COVID, never really did a whole lot of curbside or to go at all. And all of a sudden, March 17th, you're required to shut down and can do curbside only. And, by March 20th, you're starting a curbside business, trying to keep your food quality and your experience the way it was when you could dine in. But the restaurants that are doing well right now are the ones that kind of adapted to that curbside to go model. Is the biggest push.
And how has technology played a role there? I know your restaurant group even sort of embraced technology to play a big role to sort of facilitate that curbside to go experience. Can you tell us more about how that's played an impact?
Yeah, so for us, we wanted to make the experience as easy for the guests as possible. So, part of that was, how can you make a reservation online? How can you order online? And then also when you get to the restaurant, how can, as a restaurateur or a restaurant, know that you're here? So we picked a digital platform that could it's an iPad in the restaurant that when you come to the space, it tells you, you put in your name, what space you're in, and then we run the order out to you. And then obviously, the move to contactless payment was also really big in this, because nobody wants to hand their credit card in this and see people touching your credit card.
Yeah, we've been to many of your restaurants in the sort of post-COVID world. And in fact, have probably had an easier chance of being able to get into one of your restaurants virtually than sort of in person. So it's been an interesting experience for us, my partner and I, for sure. Sam, I want to turn to you now as part of this sort of impact of the contactless world. More than 2/3 of us are now working remotely. There was an interesting report recently from the conference board that said 4 in 10 businesses don't plan to open their offices anytime soon. How do you see this playing out across the real estate markets I mean, you advise lots and lots of folks in this space, and I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Sure. And thanks, Stephen, for having me. I think the point that you're raising is a critically important one. Across the country and in other parts of the world, we've seen many of the restrictions on our individual activities relaxed. We're able to go out, we're able to go to the office. People are able to work from the office once again. And yet, what we also observe is that many firms are moving much more slowly than the relaxation of government restrictions would allow. And as you cite from this one particular survey, many businesses are still in the position of really evaluating what role will work from home, working remotely play in their longer term plan. And I think it's a question that has not yet been fully resolved, and one that will only really be addressed over the course of a couple of years. What we do see right now is significant variation in business plans across different metropolitan areas, different cities, different parts of the city. The very urban office having a different experience than the relatively more suburban. One critical element of that variation, Stephen, relates to the public transportation system. And in markets where there's a significant dependence upon public transportation for professionals to get to work, what we see is that whether it's real or perceived, some anxiety around public transportation, around congestion, how that might lend itself to transmission of the virus is hindering or is at least a factor in businesses' plans to bring people back. And so, in those cities like New York, the anecdotal evidence at this point is that firms are moving much more slowly in getting people back to office in anything that looks like a pre-pandemic model than is the case in a city where we're much more apt to use cars. Longer term, I think this question of the balance between remote and in person is probably the biggest source of debate in commercial real estate. I think the baseline for me is one where remote work will, in the long term, play some significant role in how we think about engaging. There's still clearly value in physical co location to work on certain projects, tasks. It makes sense for us to get together, even aside from the fact that we all want to have the chance to see one another in person. There's economic value from co-location. That's the basis of agglomeration. But I think what we will ultimately encounter is a scenario where we'll find ourselves as in a situation where we'll be a little bit more judicious. When does it make sense to come in? What are the projects I'm working on where it makes sense to be at the office, to work together, to collaborate in person? And what are those other tasks where I can work remotely and be just as effective? This becomes really important in the long term for how we also recruit and bring new people into organizations. Bonnie, Tony, the two of us, we're all very fortunate in that we're experienced professionals with established networks. We've been able to rely on those networks over the course of the last 6 or 7 months. You can imagine a very different scenario for a relatively young person coming into an organization, maybe graduating from college or a graduate program for the first time, and having to think about how they build a network, how they develop friendships, how they develop mentoring relationships. Those are not things that they already have in place. And it's in particular for that cohort that being able to come back in person at least part of the time becomes exceptionally valuable. Overall, as a closing point, Stephen, many different aspects of commercial real estate have been upended by the crisis. It's not necessarily the case that we see a lot of new and unexpected trends emerging, as much as many of the underlying trends that were already at play, have been accelerated. And we one of the things, that whether it be sort of online shopping, the extensive use of industrial space, sort of your substitution out of bricks and mortar retail, some changes in the way that people are thinking about their location preferences for rental apartments, some of the a deterioration or adjustment in affordability in the apartment sector. A lot of these trends have just been accelerated. And in closing, there really to bring us back to Tony's point on the office side, where there's this big debate around will we go back? How much of our time will we go back? How much will it depend on sort of a vaccine? Well, part of that depends on how efficacious the vaccine is, how many people get it. But part of what we miss in that conversation is that it's not just about the office space and whether we all come back into downtown. there are all of these services and amenities that office workers and urban professionals take advantage of every day that continue to struggle tremendously in the absence of a robust workday population, and restaurants are one of those categories that has been deeply impacted, perhaps even more so than the office space itself.
So Bonnie, I want you're come from this from a design perspective. Obviously, you help companies all over the world sort of shape workspaces. You help cities sort of think about design. How do cities sort of react to some of the trends that Sam's illustrating for us? For instance, the thing that I've been thinking a lot about is gathering. How do we come together to create community in a contactless world? What can cities do to facilitate through a design perspective or through technology to enable us to at least have some sense of being able to build community together?
I think it's a great question. And I think we have to look to the fact that right now we build community in many different ways, and it's already multimodal. Obviously, we've had to lean much more into digital communications for building community during that time. But as we look to the future and kind of post-vaccine, I think we'll be back to being able to have a more balanced approach to community building that happens digitally, as well as community building that's happening where we gather together to kind of work side by side. And I guess overall, though, I think, building on what Sam said to a certain extent, this has been an accelerator for some underlying trends around the integration of both kind of digital as well as our kind of co-presence. But even more importantly, it's accelerating around expectations that people have. The choreography of life has been disrupted. The 9 to 5 of the kind of commute cycles from 9 to 5, school happening always on site. All of these things have disrupted a lot of expectations. And I think the important message for cities and companies and organizations is, how can you leverage this moment of disruption in order to really explore and experiment different ways that we might enable businesses to thrive and enable different ways that we might behave? So one example might be around the commute. We've struggled with how do we disrupt the 9 to 5, and right now what we've learned is people don't need to be at the office at 9 a.m. So we can start to look to ways that we can help facilitate and support different entry, start and end times to the travel to the office, if it even needs to happen every day, as we've already discussed. So how can we intentionally conduct experiments to figure out what works? And people come to us all the time and say, oh, you're Gensler, you must know the answer to how we build our workplaces or build our cities. And the reality is, no one really knows right now. We are in the process of learning. And the most important thing we need to do right now is to take intentional steps and listen and learn from the responses. And we can do that just through kind of watching and observing, but we can also do that by thinking about what are the right technology interventions and data collections that don't invade privacy in order to kind of create a feedback mechanism to help us choreograph our lives meaningfully moving forward.
Bonnie, that is such an excellent point. It's one of the things I've been telling my students in my urban economic development class at the LBJ school is that this is a time for us to really have to sort through those dystopian as well as those utopian views of what cities are, right? I think this is the time where we're sort of still trying to figure things out. And this is that data collection process where we can experiment and try new things. And really ask those questions about what will stick, which is actually a great segment to sort of our next sort of segment of this conversation, and that is sort of asking, what is the maybe I am going to push you to think a little bit about the future for each of you. Tony, is for many of us, going to restaurants is really kind of how we experience our cities, right? It is sort of that interesting way that we kind of fall in love with the places that we live. As you look to the future and as you're sort of seeing now about things that are sticking, maybe it's the contactless pay, maybe it is a curbside. What do you sort of see as sort of the future of the restaurant experience, maybe from a design perspective, but also maybe that integration of technology going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question because, it's still uncertain a little bit, but I can tell you things that are going to stick from what we're seeing currently is curbside, like you talked about, contactless payment. We're also going to see more outdoor space. You're going to see that as moving forward as we look for real estate here. We're going to be looking for more outdoor space. You're going to be looking at designs where you're going to have to put, before pre-COVID, you're looking at how can you get a smaller square footage, put more tables, more seats in a smaller square footage. Now you're trying to rethink, do you need to get a larger restaurant, larger square footage so that you can still get the seat count that you need? And then really looking at how do you build a curbside area, not only for the guests, so as far as parking lots go, having that accessibility for the guests, as well as in your restaurant, able to really execute curbside the way you need to. And then contactless, I think, for us, and I think most of the restaurant industry, you've been looking for a good contactless payment system for a while. Because I think we were going to go there one way or another, whether it was with COVID or without COVID. What this did do, like many of us have already talked about, it accelerated the need for it, and we're able to find a provider right away for it. So I think that technology, and also that other technology that we've been using, is QR codes, where you're popping up a menu off your QR code. You're able to see any kind of your wait list on a QR code. You're able to see things virtually that you weren't able to do before. And, quite honestly, a lot of us in the restaurant industry probably weren't even looking at things like that. We were looking more at brick and mortar, like how we've always done it. And this is kind of, reimagine some of what restaurants will look like in the future and what you're going to look for in spaces moving forward.
Yeah, it sounds like a really kind of interesting time to as Bonnie said before, experiment with new ideas, try new things. I know even as thinking about contactless education, right, as a university faculty member, this has been a fun summer for me to like reinvent my classes in this kind of geeky type of way of thinking about how you kind of create that same type of experience. Bonnie, I'd love to talk to you about sort of the future of the workplace, because I know this is something that Gensler spent a lot of time thinking about. And obviously, as you said before, folks are looking to you all to sort of provide that expertise. From your perspective, do you see our office places moving more from workplaces to meeting places? What types of design challenge may be needed? How do we incorporate this question of wellness as we look to the future of what the office looks like?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different scenarios, and working with a lot of clients in this area, they're each taking slightly different tacks. So, is the real estate market shrinking or not? Some are intentionally shrinking their real estate portfolios. Some are not and just want to rethink how they use existing space. Some see it as an opportunity to engage with the community. We have real estate, we have square footage we may not need, that we could invite the community in to be a part of this. I think there's another scenario, which is the reality of changing needs around mobility. I mentioned around the commute, but I think if we look even further into the future, especially with the rise of autonomous vehicles, and as we've seen the rise of delivery, things being kind of effortlessly moved throughout the city, the idea that fleets will start to become part of the real estate, like fleets of vehicles will become part of the real estate footprint, so that meetings will happen as much in a car, which might feel like an intimate living room on the way to the airport, as they happen in boardrooms. So this idea that there is this kind of dead space between home and office will disappear as the boundaries blur. And I think that's quite interesting. But will the offices become meeting spaces? I think they will be spaces of kind of communing and getting in touch with the reason why you work there. And depending on the company, they might take different ways of expressing that. It could be it's about everyone being together. It could be it's about, for some, we imagine that we do all of our focus work at home and we go to office for meetings, but I've talked to lots of people who focus better in the office. So how do we create spaces that can transform to meet the needs of the moment? And while the pandemic will be over, I think we're going to be there will be flu seasons, there will be weather emergencies. We're going to see lots of things happening in our environments that require that we're able to move back and forth between workplace. I think we're also going to see more hyper-localized distributed opportunities for workspaces. So instead of it being about a single hub, it's going to be about sort of influenced by co-working, localized hubs that allow you to be able to bike to the office, to avoid public transportation. And that office isn't where everyone goes, it's where people in that area go to. So the most important thing right now is again, and I think I said this before, is the intentional choreographing of how you want to craft your employee experience. And again, there are many right answers to that. And we will start to see different people gravitating to different brands that make different choices around that.
Yeah, Bonnie, what you're describing is what a lot of folks are calling that sort of 15-minute commute, or those 15-minute communities
Mhm.
where we see more integration back into live and work together in closer districts. And in fact, for many cities, as that experience that you've just described becomes a big opportunity for creating economic development in neighborhoods that have maybe been left behind, moving beyond just a sort of a central business district, those types of things. So some real opportunity there. So Sam, turn to you about more on the impact of real estate. One of the things that surprised me I guess not really surprised me, but one of the most fascinating graphics out of the New York Times when this first started was how the change of consumption patterns Americans were experiencing. And you look from everything from restaurants to vacation experiences, all seeing major declines, except for there was one little bubble on the graph that went way up to the top of the right, and that was e-commerce, buying lots of goods and services online. Thinking about your own personal experiences, the Instacarts, the Amazons, all the Fresh Directs. This is many of our lives. How do you see the rise of e-commerce impacting cities going forward? And this seems to me to be a real opportunity that I know even some REITs are sort of looking at for investment opportunities as well. Thoughts or perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right that we made a very abrupt shift to electronic commerce. We didn't have, or online commerce, we didn't really have much of a choice. In most parts of the country, retail was shuttered. If you needed something, with the exception of the grocery store, ordering off of Amazon or some other online service might have been your only realistic option. And in areas where stores were still open to some degree, or the stores you needed were open, you might have been experiencing too much anxiety or nervousness in those initial weeks of the pandemic to actually venture out and get the things you needed in person. And so it wasn't just the shift to online commerce that was so the abrupt increase. It was also sort of the mix of things that we were buying. And folks can imagine back to late March, early April. It seems a lifetime ago. Those first weeks of the pandemic in the United States, we were buying a lot of toilet paper, any hand sanitizer we could get our hands on, and binge watching The Walking Dead for life lessons on how to survive, the next couple of months. We've come a long way since then. Um, but what it has done, I think, is again accelerated that underlying trend. And I can give you an anecdotal example. One of the areas where we've seen very limited penetration of online commerce over the course of the last cycle into consumer behavior has been in groceries. So for those of us who live in cities, who may be early adopters, who sort of very flexible, sort of thinking about how to how to shop and live, using Peapod or Fresh Direct or Amazon to buy our groceries may not seem like a big leap forward, but for the median American family, that simply didn't offer a lot of appeal. I think what we've seen during the pandemic is that we've been forced out of our muscle memory on this. And a lot of families, for the first time, have engaged in online grocery sales because there weren't a lot of other good options. What we're going to ultimately see is that folks will have discovered it was easy. It was, in some cases, more cost effective. It was price competitive. There was greater product variety. It was certainly very convenient. And for a lot of people, that's gonna have appeal that will allow it to outlast the pandemic. And for some folks, they won't go back to the grocery store. So, I think that shift to online commerce, whether it's clothes, shoes, some of the other, food, some of the other categories where we would have seen more limited penetration of online commerce over the last cycle, we've really seen the trajectory accelerate. And so, coming out of this, even as stores have opened, it's a tougher outlook for bricks and mortar. And last thing on this is that over the last cycle, so many retailers, particularly the large, the super regional malls, have focused on the need to reinvent themselves in a way that is experiential. Unfortunately, what's challenging, whether we're talking about office space or retail, is that as a meeting place, as an experiential sort of space, at least in the short to medium term, experiential is out of favor. So it'll be, I think we have to think longer term when we're thinking about sort of your reconvening in the office, or really sort of repositioning retail as experiential once again.
That's great. I know we're running short on time, and so just one last sort of question for all of you, and maybe we'll do this as a bit of a round robin. As you all, from each of your vantage points, both from the restaurant industry and as well as from sort of the design of office and space to the real estate market, what do you all hope are the sort of the trends that sort of stick around in the next iteration of cities that we've described? From this great experiment, as Bonnie has framed it so eloquently. I love that frame. So what do you hope sort of sticks around, and what do you hope sort of maybe goes away? And maybe Tony we'll kick it off with you maybe on that one.
Yeah, I mean, for when you look at it through the restaurant lens, for us is, curbside sticking around, it's contactless payment. I think you're going to see for us is continue to use your phone for more things as far as getting your menu. I think there's going to be restaurants that's how you order your food prior to going in, but also then being able to create the experience that, restaurants want to create in that community. I mean, part of restaurants is getting people together, which is hard to talk about right now, but we're going to get to that point again where you're going to want a group of people. And then I see curbside staying for a really long time, where people are going to have more events in their home, but they're not going to want to cook. And this is a way for them to cater stuff in their own homes.
So that digital perspective is going to be that real front door platform for restaurants going forward, to sort of facilitate a lot of the things that you're suggesting, perhaps.
Absolutely.
So Bonnie, what about you? Thoughts on, I know that this idea of the integration, sort of addressing some of the urban challenges of congestion and things that you've referenced to the conversation. What are some things that you hope that maybe stick around as we look to the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that making intentional decisions is my hope, that because before we did things because that was the path we took. And I really just hope that we can start to think, as we recraft our lives post pandemic, where do we want to go, and when do we want to go there, and who do we want to be with? And how can we take care of the tasks that are less attractive, like making a payment so we can spend more time looking into the eyes of the person across from us at dinner? And I do believe that a lot of the task-driven stuff, that those will stick, and that it is my hope that we will think about how we replace the time we spent doing those tasks when we can re-enter the world with things that drive meaning for us, for our communities, and to kind of connect us to something perhaps larger than ourselves.
Great. Sam, any last sort of thoughts to that question about trends that you hope that stick?
Yeah, very much along the lines of what Bonnie described. It's sort of a very high level thought, which is that the abruptness of the pandemic and the shift to remote working required that we all think very, very creatively about how we can leverage technology to still get work done. But I hope the lingering impact of that, for those of us who've been fortunate enough to work remotely, given the nature of our jobs, is that the way in which we do things, the way in which we work, live, shop, whatever it is, the range of possibilities is so much broader than what we allow ourselves. And to think, to take an open approach to this and a fresh look and say, there are ways that we can that we can work and collaborate, that we can convene for meals, for collaboration, that are so much broader than what we allow ourselves when we're in that pattern of, well, this is the way we do things, as Bonnie described. I think that open-mindedness and that leveraging of technology to facilitate just a richer experience is something that does persist.
Great. Sam, Bonnie, Tony, thanks for joining us for this conversation. It's been a delight, and my much appreciation to each of you. Thanks again.
Thanks so much,
so
Stephen.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.